The story begins where honor sharpens into a blade. In the dust and marble of the early Roman Republic, Marcus Atilius Regulus strides into the record not as a myth, but as a man whose stubborn devotion to duty would outlast empires. His name survives because it collides with cruelty, because Rome, a land-born power learning to breathe salt air, found its rival across the water in Carthage, master of wars and trade winds. The First Punic War did not erupt like a single thunderclap. It gathered, cloud by cloud, over Sicily in 264 BC, when an argument over a frontier city widened into a contest for the Mediterranean itself. Rome, inexperienced at sea, lashed corvée boarding bridges onto newborn hulls and turned naval battles into infantry fights upon creaking decks. Every victory tasted of splinters and tar. Every loss taught the Senate how dearly maritime ambition would cost. Regulus was shaped for this moment. Born around 307 BC into the hard discipline of aristocratic Rome, he learned early that the Republic demanded more than clever tactics. It expected character to march ahead of the legions. By 267 BC, he had worn the consul's crimson stripe and tested his command against the Salentini in Italy's heel, where his methodical pressure and refusal to be dazzled by quick triumphs earned him a reputation for cold, reliable nerve. He was the sort of commander soldiers trusted in the dark, not because he promised safety, but because he never lied about danger. When news from Sicily darkened the form-long sieges, ships snapped by storms, Carthaginian squadrons stinging Roman coasts, Regulus's name returned to the rostrum like an answer spoken before the question finished. Rome in these years was a machine learning speed. Roads threw their gray lines farther. Colonies stamped Latin order onto rough soil. The Senate counted grain, bronze, and boys of fighting age with a bookkeeper's patience that hid ferocity. Carthage, by contrast, was a city of ledgers and hulls. Its empire braided along sea routes, its strength measured in silver and sails. To Romans, conquest proved virtue. To Carthaginians, profit proved wisdom. Between these worldviews stretched Sicily, an island of wheat, and harbors now a chessboard where every move cost ships and sons. Regulus did not yet know the shape of his fate, only the rhythm of campaign seasons and the stern arithmetic of the Senate. But already, the currents were drawing him toward a decision point that would define him. As Rome hammered keel after keel and drilled green crews into something like a fleet, his career rose on the same tide. He would be called again, not merely to hold a line in Sicily, but to gamble on audacity itself. For the Republic was tired of bleeding at the island's edges. It wanted, at last, to strike at the heart. By 256 BC, Rome's appetite for decisive victory had outgrown Sicily. The Senate, weary of attritional sieges and unending skirmishes, looked across the wine-dark sea to Africa itself. Why waste years battering Carthaginian strongholds on the island, when one bold thrust could pierce the enemy's chest? The plan was audacious. Carry the war to Carthage's homeland. Force the proud merchants of empire to fight with their homes at their backs. And at the head of this gamble stood Marcus Atilius Regulus, recalled to the consulship. His name weighted with the Senate's trust. The fleet Rome assembled was unlike anything the Republic had yet conjured. Over 300 ships, rowed by tens of thousands of men, creaked across the Mediterranean, their prows sharpened like iron teeth. On board, some 140,000 soldiers and sailors braced for a campaign that promised either immortal triumph or ruin on a scale the Republic had never endured. Imagine the sight from the African coast, a horizon bristling with masts, the sea itself disguised as a forest of Roman ambition. To Carthaginian eyes, who had long believed the sea their private dominion, it must have looked like the gods had sent an army riding waves. The landing at Clup was a thunderclap. Regulus's legions spilled onto the sand with disciplined fury, carving a beachhead before Carthage could even steady its defenses. Panic rippled inland. Carthaginian patrols fell back in confusion. Villages once secure under the merchant oligarchs now burned under the Roman standard. Ancient sources speak of wealth flowing into Roman camps, ivory figurines, gilded vessels, animals strange to Italian eyes. After years of grinding warfare in Sicily, the African countryside must have seemed like a dream of plunder-fertile fields, ripe for seizure, treasure caravans staggering under their burdens. Soldiers who had once choked on Sicilian dust now tasted the sweetness of victory with every mile. For Carthage, The shock was existential. Mothers in the city could hear the war horns of Rome echoing across their own fields. This was no longer a distant contest of fleets and colonies, it was survival. The ruling council, shaken to its core, debated desperate measures. Some whispered of surrender, of sacrificing Sicily and Sardinia, of handing over coin and ships just to preserve the city's beating heart. But when envoys approached Regulus with tentative peace terms, they met the granite wall of Roman arrogance. Regulus demanded not negotiation, but humiliation. Sicily and Sardinia surrendered outright. Crippling indemnities poured into Roman coffers. Carthage reduced to a client, bound in chains of tribute. He even insisted their proud navy shrink to a handful of ships, cutting the city's lifeline to its empire. To Carthage, these terms were annihilation disguised as treaty. They refused. And in that refusal, they invited the storm that would soon fall upon both Regulus and Rome. Into this moment of Carthaginian despair came a stranger whose name would alter the course of the war, Xanthippus, a Spartan mercenary with the bearing of a man born to command. To the Carthaginians, exhausted by defeat and humiliated by Roman audacity, he was a last throw of the dice. To Regulus, he was an unforeseen shadow on the horizon. Trained in the Spartan discipline where boys were hardened into warriors before they could grow beards, Xanthippus brought something Carthage had lacked: clarity. He studied the Roman advance with a cold eye, and told his new employers what they had not wanted to hear, that their defeats were not born of weakness, but of folly. They had been fighting on Rome's terms, letting infantry dominate while ignoring their own greatest weapons, elephants and cavalry. Under his hand, the Carthaginian army transformed. The war elephants, beasts that had terrified enemies since Alexander's time but had been poorly handled in earlier clashes, were drilled into disciplined shock troops. The Numidian horsemen, masters of skirmish and speed, were forged into a decisive hammer. Discipline, long frayed by routs, returned. Soldiers who had tasted only shame now found themselves marching with purpose, their faith rekindled by this foreign commander. Regulus, meanwhile, reveled in his victories, blind to how swiftly the winds were turning. His troops, fattened on plunder and lulled by success, grew careless. Reports of Carthaginian retraining were dismissed as desperation. Rome's general believed he stood at the brink of final triumph. But hubris is often the mask that fate wears before it strikes. The clash came near Tunis in 255 BC, on plains chosen with cruel precision by Xanthippus. Open, flat ground, the very terrain where cavalry could encircle and elephants could smash through infantry lines. The battle unfolded like a lesson carved into stone. At dawn, Carthaginian cavalry thundered forward, shattering the Roman flanks before their rigid formations could set. The elephants followed, living walls of flesh and ivory tusks, driving into the Roman center. Legionaries who had once prided themselves on discipline found themselves trampled, scattered, crushed beneath feet larger than shields. What followed was catastrophe. The Roman lines buckled, then collapsed entirely. Thousands were cut down, tens of thousands captured. Of the vast army Rome had ferried across the sea, only a pitiful fraction staggered back to Sicily. And at the heart of the rout stood Regulus, sword in hand, refusing to flee. Ancient writers tell of him fighting until exhaustion and wounds dragged him to the ground, captured alive, his body broken, but his spirit unbowed. The tide of war had turned. The man who had once seemed poised to dictate Carthage's surrender now stood in chains, his fate no longer his own. Regulus's capture might have ended his story, but in truth, it only shifted the stage. To the Carthaginians, dragging him alive from the carnage of Tunis was a prize more valuable than gold. This was no ordinary consul, no nameless commander. This was Marcus Atilius Regulus, twice chosen by the Roman Senate, a man whose name carried the weight of Roman virtue itself. Killing him outright would waste the leverage he represented. So at first, they clothed their victory in courtesy. He was housed with honor, granted food and treatment befitting his rank. To humiliate him too soon would squander his political value. From his chamber in captivity, Regulus became both a man and a symbol. His name still carried across the sea, whispered in Rome as a reminder of both defeat and resilience. Mothers told their children that Regulus endured for the Republic. Soldiers, weary in Sicily's trenches, swore his patience would mirror their own. To the Senate, he was a bargaining chip worth more alive than dead. Carthage, sensing this, began to weave a plan to turn their prisoner into a messenger. Years dragged on. The war bled both sides dry, Rome straining to build fleets faster than storms and Carthaginian rams could sink them, Carthage staggering under Roman raids and naval defeats. Neither side could find the decisive stroke. And so, sometime around 250 BC, Carthaginian leaders hatched a gamble. Regulus would be sent back to Rome under strict conditions. He would deliver Carthage's peace proposals to the Senate. If accepted, the war would end. If rejected, he must return voluntarily to captivity. To bind him, they demanded an oath before the gods that he would return if Rome refused. To the ancient mind, such a vow was not parchment formality. An oath was sacred iron, heavier than chains. The gods themselves were thought to punish those who broke it, cursing not just the oathbreaker but his family. Carthage believed they had caught Rome in a perfect trap. Their most famous prisoner would plead for peace, bound by his own honor, and Rome would be compelled to listen. Regulus, though, accepted without hesitation. Why? The sources argue. Some say he meant to honor the oath, to serve his captors faithfully until Rome was free to decide. Others claim he already knew he would betray their expectations, that his return to Rome was not deliverance but sacrifice. Whatever his true intention, he set sail once more for Italy, a man torn from chains yet carrying them invisibly with him. As the ship's prow cut northward, the Italian coastline drawing closer, Regulus must have wondered what awaited him. Years had passed since he had seen his wife and children. Rome believed him dead. Now he would walk again among his people, not as a liberator, but as a messenger sent from the enemy's hand. The irony was brutal. Carthage had freed their lion, not realizing he was about to bare his teeth against them once more. When Regulus stepped once more onto Italian soil, it was as if a ghost had returned. Crowds thronged the harbor to glimpse the man long thought lost, their awe sharpened by the scars of captivity that lined his face and frame. His wife, Marcia, rushed to him with tears and trembling hands, children clinging to the father they had only half remembered. Yet joy was tainted with dread, for Regulus came home not free, but bound by an oath heavier than iron. He must return to Carthage if peace was refused. His embrace with his family was therefore both reunion and farewell, as though every kiss carried the taste of parting. Rome itself stirred at the news. Senators and citizens whispered in the forum, asking, what would Regulus say? Was Carthage truly desperate? Could this long and ruinous war finally end? Some saw hope, others smelled danger. The Senate chamber filled with a tension so thick it might have been cut with a blade. Into this hall Regulus walked thinner, older, yet still upright, his eyes steady despite the torment he had endured. The Carthaginian terms he carried were clear. Rome must lay down Sicily, pay indemnities, and agree to humiliations that would clip the Republic's wings. Carthage hoped Regulus's prestige would soften Roman resolve. Instead, it hardened it. Standing before his peers, Regulus did what no Carthaginian had foreseen. He argued against peace. He urged the Senate not to yield, warning that the enemy's offers sprang from weakness, not generosity. To accept would be to invite Rome's slow strangulation. Better to suffer now, he insisted, than to live forever in chains. His words were not rhetoric polished by a schoolmaster, but the raw conviction of a man who knew his advice would cost him his life. The Senate was shaken. Here was a man who could have chosen safety, who could have embraced his family and clung to life, yet instead chose to speak for Rome's honor. Some senators wept openly. Others begged him to remain, to break the oath after all. What oath made under duress could truly bind a Roman? Citizens cried out in the streets, pleading that he stay. Yet Regulus silenced them all, with unyielding resolve. To him, duty was not negotiable. His oath, however cruelly won, was sacred. In that moment, Regulus became something larger than consul, larger than general. He became the embodiment of the Roman creed. That honor was dearer than breath. As he left the chamber, the Senate's decision was sealed. Rome would reject Carthage's terms, and Regulus himself would walk willingly back into the jaws of his enemy. The Senate's vote was cast. Rome would reject Carthage's plea for peace. Victory would come not through compromise but through endurance, no matter the cost in coin or blood. For a moment, the The chamber seemed to quake with the weight of the choice. Yet all eyes turned not to the future campaigns, but to the solitary figure who had sealed their resolve, Regulus, who had just argued himself into a death sentence. In the days that followed, Rome seemed to breathe around him like a living paradox. Citizens gathered outside his home, pressing forward with petitions and tears. "Break the oath," they urged. "The gods cannot demand a vow forced at knife's edge. Stay here. Stay with us." Women threw garlands at his feet. Old soldiers clasped his hands, pleading that his life mattered more to Rome than any oath. But Regulus remained unshaken. To violate his sworn word, he argued, would dishonor not only himself but the Republic. What trust could allies or subjects place in Rome if its leaders treated oaths as fragile reeds, to be bent or broken when inconvenient? His faith was that Rome's greatness lay not in victories alone, but in the integrity of its word, even when that word condemned him. His final days with his family carried the quiet terror of an extended funeral. Marcia, his wife, bore her grief with the same steel as her husband, yet in private she surely felt the torment of losing him twice, once to capture, and now to his own resolve. Their children, still too young to grasp the full scale of their father's sacrifice, would one day inherit a name, burnished by legend, but scarred by absence. What conversations passed between them in the lamplight? No chronicler records. But one imagines farewells spoken in fragments, silences carrying more weight than words. When the day of departure came, Rome itself seemed to escort him. Crowds lined the road as Regulus walked through the city in simple garments, not in triumph, but in surrender freely chosen. Senators bowed their heads, women wept aloud, even hardened veterans turned away to hide their tears. It was a procession unlike any Rome had seen, a living funeral march for a man who would not bend. And then, as his ship pushed away from the Italian shore, Regulus looked upon the coast of his homeland one final time. The walls of Rome faded into the horizon, and the sea stretched ahead like a grave. Carthage awaited, not as a battlefield now, but as an execution ground. Yet, Regulus did not falter. His duty was clear, and he would walk into torment with the same steadiness with which he had once walked into war. Carthage had gambled on Regulus's honor, and now that honor had returned to them like a knife turned inward. Their prisoner had stood before Rome and, instead of pleading their cause, urged his people to fight on. To Carthaginian leaders, this was betrayal of the highest order. The man they had hoped would bring peace had instead delivered humiliation. And humiliation, in antiquity, demanded blood. What followed was no sudden frenzy of rage, but a cold, calculated descent into cruelty. At first, they stripped Regulus of his comforts, confining him to darkness and noise so that sleep would not come. Days blurred into nights lit by blinding lamps, a torture as much of the mind as of the body. When exhaustion threatened to collapse him, they escalated. His eyelids were cut away, condemning him to perpetual wakefulness, his eyes seared raw beneath the African sun. The torment was both symbolic and practical. He could never close his eyes to Carthaginian wrath. Next came the spiked box. Narrow, confining, lined with sharp points, it allowed no rest and no movement without pain. Every breath, every twitch of muscle pressed his body into iron teeth that tore his flesh. It was a prison designed not merely to injure, but to turn his own body into an instrument of suffering. Here was cruelty elevated into philosophy, as though his captors meant to prove that even the proudest Roman could be reduced to a trembling carcass by time and pain. Yet witnesses record that Regulus did not break. His body weakened, his voice cracked, but the dignity that had carried him through Senate debates and battlefields remained. His tormentors, frustrated by this endurance, resolved upon a final spectacle. A massive bronze cauldron was prepared, filled not with water but with oil. Oil, to the ancient world, was wealth and purity, a substance of anointing and trade. To boil a man in it was to turn abundance into horror, a ritual inversion of prosperity. The execution was staged as theater, Regulus suspended above the cauldron by ropes, lowered slowly so that the crowd could savor every instant. The first touch of his feet against the bubbling surface drew a cry that silenced even the jeering masses. Flesh hissed, steam rose, and Rome's proud consul became a human offering to Carthaginian vengeance. Inch by inch, they lowered him, until the oil consumed his body. His screams echoed against stone, then fell quiet as shock overtook pain. The crowd dispersed slowly, uneasy despite their thirst for revenge. For even in death Regulus had given them no satisfaction. The man they boiled alive had refused to surrender in spirit, and in killing him, they had minted a martyr whose legend would burn brighter than their cruelty. When news of Regulus's death reached Rome, it spread not like a whisper, but like fire. Merchants returning from Carthage carried tales of torture so calculated, so monstrous, that even hardened veterans shuddered. Sleep torn away, eyelids carved off, a spiked coffin of agony, and finally the slow boiling in oil. The details were repeated in taverns, marketplaces, and senate halls until every Roman knew them by heart. His torment became more than a story, it was a rallying cry. For Marcia, his widow, grief hardened into vengeance. Ancient sources tell that when Carthaginian prisoners fell into Roman hands, she oversaw punishments that mirrored her husband's suffering. Sleep was denied, cages with spikes confined them, and cruelty answered cruelty. Whether all these tales are literal or embellished, the truth remains. Regulus's fate ignited a cycle of atrocity. In the Punic Wars that followed, mercy was cast aside. Each side learned to wield terror as a weapon, and thousands paid the price. Yet from Rome's anguish emerged something larger than rage, a myth. Regulus became the exemplar of Roman virtue, proof that honor could weigh heavier than life itself. Poets immortalized him, philosophers held his name as a mirror of stoic endurance. To schoolboys, his choice was taught as the measure of duty returning to certain death, rather than dishonor his oath. Even centuries later, orators would summon his ghost in speeches to remind citizens that the Republic's greatness was not born of wealth or power, but of men willing to bleed for principle. Outside Rome, his story echoed across the Mediterranean. Allies marveled at a people who valued oaths above survival. Enemies learned a darker lesson. Rome was not a state to be bargained with lightly. The sacrifice of Regulus gave the Republic a reputation for grim steadfastness, a moral armor as potent as its legions. Carthage had meant to break him as an example. Instead, they forged him into a legend that outlived both their empire and his republic. Historians still debate the precise details of his torture, but the essence remains. A man chose fidelity over life, and his captors answered with cruelty designed to annihilate body and spirit. They failed. Regulus died, yes, but he died unbroken, and in doing so, transformed defeat into immortality. More than 2 millennia later, his story still unsettles us, not only for the depths of human cruelty it reveals, but for the haunting question it leaves behind. What would we choose when duty and life pull in opposite directions? For Regulus, the answer was clear. And in that clarity, Rome found both its most tragic loss and its most enduring triumph.